A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, Complete 7-volume Combined Edition. Preface by Doug Thompson. Those familiar with the editions of A Course in Miracles previously available will find this edition of the Urtext Manuscripts substantially different, especially in the early chapters of the text volume, due to the fact that it is far closer to the original dictation, having been typed by the scribes before most of the subsequent editing and abridgment took place. While much more extensive documentation is provided in the appendices, in this preface I wish to very briefly summarize the major attributes of this work, explain what distinguishes it from other editions of A Course in Miracles, and briefly describe the purpose behind its preparation and publication. Many will know that the course was first printed in 1976 by the Foundation for Inner Peace, that it has subsequently sold millions of copies, that it has been translated into many other languages, and that it is increasingly quoted in published works. The Foundation's claim that its version is virtually unchanged from the original inner dictation received by Columbia University psychology professor Dr. Helen Schumann beginning in 1965 was widely accepted for many years. Schumann and her colleague Dr. William Thetford repeatedly retyped the original shorthand notes, and over the course of a decade the first manuscript was edited into the much shorter version that was published by the Foundation for Inner Peace in 1975 as A Course in Miracles. This voice was, according to Schumann, unambiguously that of Jesus of Nazareth. In January of 2000, 3 earlier versions of the course emerged on the internet, which were dramatically different in the first 8 chapters. Far from being virtually unchanged, the earlier manuscripts not only contained a vast amount of previously unpublished material, they reveal that in the later editing, much that wasn't entirely removed was extensively rewritten, sometimes almost beyond recognition. Prior to 2000, only one version of the course was available, the abridged version published by A Foundation for Inner Peace. The 3 earlier versions which have emerged are, in chronological order of their creation, the original shorthand notes, the scribe's very first slightly edited urtext, the scribe's second edit, the substantially abridged Hugh Lynn Casey version, HLC. Our 4 versions then consist of these 3 manuscripts, which had remained hidden for decades, plus the abridgment of the HLC prepared by Schumann and Wapnick in 1973-74. Published by the Foundation for Inner Peace beginning in 1975 as virtually unchanged, it is in fact the 4th major revision of which copies have surfaced, being some 48,000 words shorter and substantially rewritten in the early chapters. There is very good reason to believe that the scribes prepared additional manuscripts which either have not survived or are still being withheld from scholarship by their custodians. However, many additional manuscripts there may be, these 4 very different versions of the course we currently have allow us to trace the extent and nature of the editing from the first scribing, the notes, to the last editing, the 1975 abridgment, along with 2 points in between. An examination of the differences from one version to the next reveals a number of common elements. In each version, some scribal errors were corrected. Due to a near total lack of proofreading, there are many hundreds of copying errors from one version to the next. Many are dropouts in which a word or two, a line or two, a paragraph or two, in one case an entire page, was inadvertently omitted. Most of these errors are reproduced in subsequent versions along with new ones introduced with each retyping, such that it is true that the more they edited it, the worse it got, in a very real and measurable way. Substantial segments which were not removed were rewritten, in some cases changing most of the words but not noticeably changing the meaning, and in other cases apparently altering the material unintentionally such that the original meaning is distorted or even entirely lost. The extent and frequency of rewriting increases over time. There is very little in the early editing in the Urtext manuscripts, and what there is really is minor. In the last edit, there is a vast amount of rewriting which frequently entirely changes the meaning of passages. In some cases, material is preserved accurately but is removed from the original topic of which it is a part and placed in an entirely different discussion, thus altering the meaning of the passage in context. Again, there is very little of this at first and considerably more in the later versions. While many of these differences are individually of little significance and would attract little notice if few in number, they are not few in number, and collectively, the fact that there are thousands of them is of considerable significance. The complete removal of the lengthy discussion on sex and possession, whether one views its removal as a correction or a corruption, cannot be fairly described as a minor change. If we then consider the differences as a whole, it is fair to say that the net effect of such a vast number of mistakes is to substantially blur and in some cases distort the message which Schumann initially heard and committed to paper. Most who have read both this Urtext version and the later abridged versions find the earlier version to be much more readable and understandable. While the abridgment certainly retains most of the core message, it often does so in extremely condensed, abbreviated language which is missing large amounts of explanatory material and concrete examples illustrating the points being made. For the newcomer being introduced to the concepts for the first time, the removal of these bridges and explanations can make the material seem incomprehensibly dense. In some cases, the editing changes introduce overt distortions. Some of the omitted material is in fact extremely significant. The Urtext says, "I want to finish the instructions about sex because this is an area the miracle worker must understand." Not just that line, but all the instructions about sex vanish in later versions, despite the author particularly drawing attention to the vital importance of this material. Because each version contains some material not found in any other, and each version after the original notes corrects some errors in earlier versions, none of these four versions by itself includes the whole of the dictation, and none is without flaws. The Urtext has several advantages relative to the other versions. It has much less editing than any later version. It does have a few changes, however, and they are predominantly of three kinds. Dictated corrections are incorporated, where the notes contains dictated instructions for correcting previous material. In the Urtext, the instructions are usually removed and the corrections are made as instructed. There is at least one exception where the dictated corrections were not made. The instruction to capitalize cause and effect, for instance, is recorded, but the words were not subsequently capitalized. In a few cases, the dictated instructions remain. The addition of a dozen or so dictated without notes segments, which appear to be genuine dictation added after the initial scribing as expansion, clarification or correction of previous points. While not present in the notes, most of this material is preserved in subsequent editions, having been accepted by all subsequent editors as authentic, despite its absence from the notes. The omission of most of the entirely personal comments, which generally involve discussions between Schumann and the voice about personal relationship matters, dreams, and the like. This material was clearly never intended to be part of the course, and its removal is directed by the voice. Aside from these three differences, each of which can be viewed as an enhancement vis-à-vis the notes, very little of the rearrangement and rewriting so noteworthy in the later editing appears in the urtext. While there are some dropouts of words and phrases, there are not many compared to the later versions. In order to determine what the original dictation really was, all the changes made to any particular passage need to be traced and evaluated through all the versions. In most cases, it is fairly obvious which of the variant readings is the most authentic. In some cases, two or more variants appear at first glance to be equally plausible candidates for authenticity. This work of thorough analysis of the variants from which we can expect a critical addition of high reliability and authenticity to eventually emerge is a large undertaking which will likely not be completed for several years. Until that analysis is completed, the urtext is overall the most complete and accurate rendition of the original dictation available. It has fewer omissions and editing mistakes than later versions, and it is more complete than the earlier notes and otherwise mostly identical to the notes. To facilitate identification and assessment of variants, this print edition is complemented by an optional data disc containing both photographic facsimile and searchable e-text copies of the historical scribal manuscripts which are currently available. These are all substantially cross-referenced to a single universal reference system, such that with a bit of practice, one can locate any particular passage in any particular version in a matter of seconds. A concordance has also been prepared for the urtext and HLC versions. With these tools, the reader who is curious as to the originality or authenticity of a particular passage can quickly check to see how it was rendered in the other versions. With this information, the reader can assess the variants for herself. It is frequently the case, especially with the more heavily edited versions, that a perplexing passage immediately becomes clear when checked against the original dictation. Many of the perplexities in the later versions are simply copying mistakes. Others are confusing because they have been removed from their original context. Yet others are clearer in light of the expanded discussion originally dictated. In some cases, ambiguous readings become clear simply by seeing which words were originally emphasized. Currently, we have completed 2 of the 3 pre-1976 versions as substantially accurate e-texts, the HLC, completed in 2006, and the urtext, completed in 2008. The notes has only been partly transcribed into e-text form. When that ongoing work is finished, it will be quite easy to generate a comprehensive list of all the editing changes between all the known versions, or a catalogue of variant readings. Armed with that list of all the editing changes and the tools of textual scholarship, it should be fairly easy to evaluate all variants and sort them into those which are obviously mistakes, those which are obviously corrections, and those which are uncertain. While further research may ultimately establish some uncertain variants as either corrections or mistakes, if one were to simply reproduce the course with all the obvious mistakes corrected, all the obvious corrections preserved, and the uncertain variants simply footnoted, one would have a significantly more complete and accurate version than any one of the known historical versions. Such a version would include the most authentic material from all sources, correct the obvious mistakes, preserve all later corrections of earlier errors, and footnote any uncertainties. There are several purposes for this edition and for its publication at this time. The objective of identifying all editing changes in order to sort and evaluate them required accurate e-texts of each of the historical scribal versions. Preparing such a list manually by visually comparing the facsimile image files is enormously labor-intensive and very prone to error. Since we want accurate e-texts from which print editions can be typeset anyway, and since the easiest and most reliable way of generating a catalogue of variant readings is to have a computer compare the versions, the first stage of the process is to generate accurate e-texts, machine-readable copies, of each version, which can then be compared with software which can quickly identify every difference. Of course, as each manuscript was completed and proved for accuracy, it was possible to format the electronic text for printing. Since there is a substantial public demand for print copies and since most of the copies in circulation are exceedingly inaccurate, we felt it would be very inappropriate not to make these more accurate e-texts available in print editions as soon as they were completed. The increasing popularity and influence of the course makes it more important than ever that the course be available in the most complete and accurate form possible, with all genuine uncertainties honestly disclosed rather than disguised. The authority and credibility of its message is severely reduced by the presence of typos and omissions and distortions which focus attention away from the importance of the message and onto the shortcomings of the copy in use. As more people read it and more people quote it and its ideas gain more influence, minor errors can have a major deleterious impact on the public dialogue. So too, the perception that an edition is highly unreliable undermines both public confidence and the perceived authority of the material, even where the particular passage in question is entirely accurate. Where the focus should be on the meaning of the words and the ideas they symbolize, we often end up being sidetracked by the fact that some of the words were miscopied. Instead of focusing on the message, the focus turns to the messenger and the message itself can get lost in the process. Where the question should be, is the message authentic? What too often happens is a debate as to whether the copy is accurate. That kind of uncertainty is not difficult to dispel with honest, thorough scholarship. That kind of uncertainty is regrettably exasperated by editions which claim a level of accuracy much greater than they actually deliver. When the messenger is found to be misleading and the advertising false, many have mistakenly extrapolated that therefore the message must also be fraudulent. When dealing with material which claims authorship by Jesus of Nazareth, inevitably there will be skepticism and the suspicion that this claim arises not from truth, but rather from delusions or outright fraud. The important area of investigation in terms of the authority and authenticity of this material relates to the process by which Helen Schumann first put these words on paper in her notebooks. The later copying and editing mistakes are really an entirely separate issue with no necessary reflection on the authenticity of the original dictation. Later copying mistakes are irrelevant to the basic question. Just how did Schumann come up with these words, and where did they come from in the first place? Was her belief that she was hearing Jesus of Nazareth correct? Was she mistaken? Or was she a conspirator in a grand hoax? The most important question of fraud relates to the original scribing and whether Schumann really heard a voice or simply composed the material herself, with possible input from others, and then later misrepresented the material either because she suffered from delusions or because of deliberate fraud. This is the basic question every skeptic will have for the material. Indeed, is a basic question every reader should ask and must answer, because one's opinion of the authorship cannot help but influence one's opinion of the authority. It is much more difficult to answer that question from inaccurate, abridged copies than it is from the actual primary source material itself, or at least accurate copies of the material. The question of who is the author of this material is not important to everyone, but it is important to many, and answering it with confidence is severely hampered by lack of access to the actual authentic original dictation as first recorded. The decades of suppression of the primary source material have only managed to increase doubt and convince many skeptics that there really must be something to hide. What other motive could there be for trying to keep the source material secret? If Schumann was involved in a conspiracy to deceive, if she was honestly confused, if she was unknowingly exercising some unusual savant ability unconnected to anything supernatural, then her perception of this work as being authored by Jesus is very likely mistaken. If there is evidence of such inadvertent or even deliberate deception, it will be found in the original notes, and subsequent copying mistakes are quite irrelevant except that they serve to muddy the waters. However, the presentation of a substantially altered text as virtually unchanged not only introduces deception because the statement is far from being entirely true, it makes it all the more difficult to interrogate the really important witness, which is the original words as Schumann wrote them down. It also gives skeptics some very good reasons to be even more doubtful of the integrity of the message when they find the messengers so notably lacking in that regard. The extent and nature of the editing changes is an interesting topic, but quite a different one from the question of the source and authenticity of the original dictation. Both questions will likely be researched and investigated for years to come. With further research, we can expect increasing clarity, and quite probably that research will discover things which will surprise many. The author makes an interesting comment on the problem of scribal errors. From the notes, 467. As long as you read crossed out, take accurate notes, every word is meaningful, but I can't always get through. Whenever possible, I will correct retroactively. Be sure to note all later corrections. A few pages later in the notes, in a quote preserved in the urtext, we read, "Contradictions in my word mean lack of understanding or scribal failures, which I make every effort to correct. But they are still not crucial. The Bible has the same problem, I assure you, and it's still being edited. Consider the power of my word in that it has withstood all the attacks of error and is the source of truth." The sometimes lively debate about the importance of the errors is addressed here usefully in a manner which acknowledges the insight of two divergent viewpoints. By saying every word is meaningful, the author is saying that it's not wholly unimportant that the right words be put in the right place. Elsewhere, he states that every word was carefully chosen. By saying that errors are not crucial, however, he's stating that getting the words right, although important, is not the only or even the most important thing. He says the power of my word can withstand error. And we have here an interesting and direct comparison of the course to the Bible as both being manifestations of the Word which are imperfect and in need of correction. Elsewhere, the author several times identifies errors in the Bible and sets out to correct them. While those holding the view that either the Bible or the course is infallible might take offense at this, those who recognize that no book is, or ever likely will be, perfect, will be more inclined to look with interest at Jesus' suggested corrections. And finally, we have the notion of retroactive correction, which suggests that the author intends to correct any scribal errors over time, presumably as much time as it takes. The idea that either the course or the Bible achieved a state of perfection at a certain point in time from which no further improvements can be made is one that can be believed to be the truth, but it certainly cannot be demonstrated to be the truth. This retroactive correction has two necessary conditions. The first is a willingness to concede that there is at least some importance to identifying and correcting scribal and editing mistakes. We can't begin to cooperate with the author in the correction of mistakes if we deny there are any or insist that such errors in his words are entirely meaningless. A second necessary condition expressed several times in the course is that we must ask. We must ask and be willing to hear without filtering the voice of the Holy Spirit through our own preconceptions of what it should or shouldn't say, and instead seek only for what it really does say. Seek and ye shall find has a corollary. Don't seek and you won't find. This retroactive correction will take place whenever possible, and it is our goal to join with all who are prepared to meet the necessary conditions to make it possible to present the course with the purity and integrity it so richly deserves. This edition of the Urtext Manuscripts is one important step toward that goal. I'd like to be very clear that it is far from my intent to attack or condemn other editions of A Course in Miracles, which are somewhat lacking in accuracy and completeness, or those responsible for those editions. Such editions have blessed many lives, and their shortcomings are not, as the author has stated, crucial. I firmly believe that those who have published the course in the past have done the best they could with the often limited skills and resources which were available to them at the time. I'm rather certain that in 1976, those responsible for the decision to publish were largely unaware of many of the problems with that version. I'm also convinced that the world is far better off because they did publish what they did, when they did, than would have been the case if they had waited for years attempting to proofread to perfection. If they felt it was just the way Jesus wanted it, I think they were right. I think Jesus wanted it in print, knew the errors were not crucial, and did not want them to delay further. That does not mean, as some have argued, that it was free of errors or that Jesus didn't want to correct the copying mistakes later when there was more time and perhaps more willingness. There is a tendency among followers of most bodies of scripture to wish to believe that their holy book is complete, inerrant, infallible, and the last word. I can certainly understand the desire for perfection and a clear definitive statement that is unambiguous and absolutely trustworthy now and forever. That sort of thing can't be put between the covers of a book, however, and it is a serious misperception to suppose that it can be. The living God is dynamic, as is the relationship of love between himself and his creation. While the will of God is changeless, its expression in time through people is not, and no body of symbols given through people at a particular point in history can ever be the last thing God has to communicate to his creation. A book is static, like a snapshot, and like a photo, it can be accurate or it can be blurred by flaws and scratches and lose clarity through multiple recopying. But it is not alive. It does not find ever new forms with which to express the changeless truth. It is just one set of symbols from one moment in time, frozen in that moment. The author makes some useful comments on this aspect of words. The purpose of words is to limit, and by limiting to make a vast area of experience more manageable. But that means manageable by you. For many aspects of living in this world that is necessary, but not for asking. God does not use words and does not answer in words. He can only speak to the Christ in you, who translates his answer into whatever language you can understand and accept. Sometimes words will limit fear, sometimes not. That is why some people hear words, some receive feelings of inner conviction, and some do not become aware of anything. Yet God has answered, and his answer will reach you when you are ready. God is the ultimate reality, and words on pages are twice removed. This we must remember when we seek to project onto them real aspects of God, such as infallibility, changelessness, perfection, inerrancy, etc. To project attributes of divine reality onto a symbol is really idolatry and magic thinking. It is the worship of symbols or symbols of symbols in place of the worship of that which is symbolized, the one thing that is real, God, our Creator. Words are helpful if they direct our attention and concentration on reality. Words are counterproductive if we confuse them for reality and make of the symbols idolatrous objects of worship. In the last analysis, the best version of A Course in Miracles is the one you read and the one to which you open your heart to the redemptive message of love and forgiveness, a message they all contain. One should also bear in mind that while for most readers faced with a variety of different versions, there is an obvious question about which one to choose, the respective versions are not competitors so much as they are complements. Each has unique strengths and weaknesses. Each is a witness to a single historical event, that even being Helen Schumann's hearing a remarkable discourse and her note-taking during that hearing. Schumann's hearing was not perfect. Her note-taking was not perfect. In her efforts to correct the errors in later editing, for a variety of reasons, she ended up introducing progressively more new errors while fixing a few earlier ones each time. Each version then is a precious resource, and each gives us more information about that original event to which each is a witness. By retracing her steps backwards through the versions and the editing and copying mistakes, we can generally distinguish the mistakes from the corrections with ease and do what no version yet to appear has done: extract the best from each of them. I use the witness metaphor here for several reasons. Schumann can be thought of an eyewitness or ear witness to a historical event. During the event, she took notes, but did not take them without error. Later, she reviewed her notes and retyped them, at least 4 times over the course of 10 years. Each time the story changed a little. Each time there were some inadvertent copying mistakes. It's not uncommon that human memories of events change over time. Memories don't always change over time. Sometimes humans can remember with astonishing photographic precision, but memories often change dramatically, and except by comparison to such data and photos and original written records, we can't tell which memories are pristine and which have evolved. With that thought in mind, it certainly does seem likely that the earliest record Schumann made of the event is most often most likely to be the most accurate in certainty, less subject to inadvertent copying mistakes and later evolved memories or even interpretation on her part. It is quite possible that certain passages came to mean something very different to her 10 years later. Which is the more important though? What the voice originally said or how Schumann interpreted it a decade later? Both may be interesting and relevant, but they are 2 very different kinds of data. For many purposes, it is important to distinguish, if possible, which words are original and which words are a much later scribal interpretation of the original. Whichever version we happen to prefer, it is important to be honest about which is which and refrain from claiming that the one is the other. A great deal of additional information about this edition, the various versions, and the process by which editorial decisions were made in the preparation of this edition can be found in the appendices. And now I invite you to turn the page and begin reading, remembering the first line of the dictation Schumann recorded in the notes, and who it was who spoke those words. You will see miracles through your hands through me. That is how the course originally began. That line, which was edited out of later versions, was simply moved down a bit in the urtext as the scribes followed the editing instructions. It is crucial to say first that this is a required course. They followed that instruction and put that part first. Here in the urtext, the entire instruction is preserved, while in later versions, the words of instruction, it is crucial to say first that, were removed and probably quite appropriately. In this example and numerous others, the reader will detect places in the urtext where some editing is indeed appropriate. Aside from the correction of the most blatant typing mistakes and standardization of spelling, the scribal urtext manuscripts are presented as is on these pages, warts and all. The time for editing will come. In this edition, we simply present it with a bare minimum of editing for print. For the purposes of reference, cross-reference, and citation, we have included 3 different reference systems. Bold numbers in line, which are the original manuscript page numbers. These make checking back to the original manuscript facsimils very easy. For cross-referencing to the HLC, the chapter and section breaks from that version have been inserted. These mostly correspond to the chapter and section divisions in the later Foundation for Inner Peace abridgments. For cross-referencing to the notes page number for each section heading is indicated. For more details on the referencing system, see Appendix 3.